It's actually a kind of, it's based on a series of research I've done after my PhD. So as you mentioned, my PhD work was on the Moroccan hometown associations. And it is to say there's this involvement of people living in France, but they clustered around village associations. They reformed kind of a village community in France. And then they put together money and they built up, they electrified their village, they built up schools, health centers, roads, they refurbished their town hall, and this kind of initiative. And then these hometown associations, that's how we call it mostly in the American literature on this issue. It's not something which is specific to Moroccans. It's something which can be found, this type of behavior. We can find it everywhere in the world. I mean, Mexicans in the US do it. Indians in the UK, they do it. You can also find the Senegalese, the Malians, the Vietnamese, the who else? Maybe the Jews. The Jews in the 19th century, they were also active and reforming hometown association in New York. So this type of behavior is not specific to Moroccans, and it's not specific to our modern times. It's not only today, and and it's not specific to international migration as well. It's something which can be found, for example, in Nigeria. The people coming from the countryside, when they go to Lagos, they reform this hometown association as well, these groups of villagers. And just an anecdote, Karl Marx, when he was a student, I don't remember where, but he was in Germany, he was member of his hometown associations when he was a student in Germany. So this is something which can be found everywhere. Not everywhere. For example, the French, when they migrate, they do not form hometown associations. But it can be found almost everywhere. And my work, after having finished to work on the Moroccans, was to understand why. Why this pattern of organizations among migrants is so universal. And the second question I had is that, well, it's not new, but what is new is that really recently, in the 90s, in the early, mid-90s, suddenly, almost everywhere in the world, we can find this kind of groups being more and more involved in development. And more, we can see a surge of what we call the collective remittances. You know, individual remittances, the money which is sent to the family back home. But collective remittances are these projects, these collective projects organized and set up by migrants for the benefit of their village of origin. And these kind of initiatives, this surge in development practices, it can be found almost at the same time, a bit everywhere, between groups which have no connection between each other. I mean, the Mexicans in the US, they started to build up roads in the middle of Zacatecas, or near Guadalajara, or a bit everywhere. And in the literature, we can find that it started really in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was exactly at the same time that I observed the same type of behavior among the Moroccans. And then I moved to and so this is my other question. So why suddenly we cannot find this kind of common patterns a bit everywhere? So these are my two questions. And then, in order to address this issue, I use a comparative framework. And I compared three groups: the Moroccans, but also the Algerians, and the Indians in the UK, not in France, but in the UK. And why is that? Well, it's I don't know if you know a little bit the comparison, the comparative framework, it's a specific methodology. And there is something which is very powerful with comparison. It is a very powerful tool in social sciences to have generalizable results, to generalize, to move beyond one single case study. when you work on one single case study, okay, you can find what's going on, but you can never be sure that it will work for the others. And in order to find these generalizable results, I compare two groups which are very close to each other. The Moroccan, okay, I should not say now Moroccans, because I haven't worked on the Moroccans, actually. I've worked on a Berber group, which are the Schleur. It's very important, I will tell you why. So the Schleur, coming from the south of Morocco, on the one hand, and the Kabyle. So it's another Berber group coming from northern Algeria, and the Kabyle as well. And the Schleur and the Kabyle going to France are really very similar history, very relatively parallel history of a migration which started during the colonial times under the French rule. And moving to relatively the same areas in France, relatively, not exactly, but relatively the same areas. And so, but the thing is that the Schleur are super active when it comes to development practices, but not the Kabyle. And so when you compare two groups who are very similar but have one difference, you can focus on why is it so different. And then I compared the Moroccans, the Moroccan Schleur, with an Indian group based in the UK, which are the Punjabis, the Sikh Punjabis. And these have distinct patterns of integration. The Moroccans in France are pretty more working class people, whereas the Punjabis and the Indians in general are now very successful, very wealthy. They have other patterns of socialization, of integration, of incorporation. It is a different legal framework. It's a multicultural society, whereas France is supposed to be a assimilationist country. So different groups, but like the Moroccans, the Indian Punjabis are also very active when it comes to development issues. So why is that? When you compare two different groups, then you can focus on the common points. So that was my methodology. So it's a sorry, I got to go back to my text. And so from there, I could try to figure out some kind of and try to find out some generalizable results about what a hometown association is, what is it created, and why they behave like how they behave. But also, I try also to reflect on what is transnationalism at large, not only hometown transnationalism, but transnational practices at large. So maybe, yeah. Where is my remote? Yeah, here it is. Yeah, okay. Okay. Maybe you are not so much familiar with transnationalism. So first of all, I will present you this research framework. It's a kind of now, it's a strong paradigm in migration studies. So transnationalism is a study of what migrants do in between the arrival country and the origin country. So we tend to distinguish between three main pillars in migration studies: the study of migration and development, so on the sending countries; the study of integration, incorporation in the arrival societies; and then there is a third branch, a third pillar, which are the transnational studies. So what they do in between. So the circulation of people, of things, of ideas, of money, and the kind of sociality, social fields that they create between the arrival and sending countries. So this approach is not new. We have been working for a long time on this in-betweenness. But the studies of, until the 70s were relatively rare, very few studies, and nothing systematic, no theoretical background, no methodological tool, nothing. It really picked up in the 70s, and we could identify three range of pioneer studies before the transnationalism as we know it now appeared. So the first origin probably is in France with the circulation migratoire paradigm. So the circulation migratoire, it's an approach which has been founded by my research center, MIGRINTER, and more specifically by a geographer called Gildas Simon, who founded this approach. And the circulation migratoire is a study of any form of circulation induced by migration. So the circulation of people themselves, but also the circulation of ideas, of money, of goods, but also the circulation of, because we are geographers, of transportation means. So the bus routes between for example, Barcelona and Morocco, the airlines, and all this economy which is induced by the circulation of people, and the circulation migratoire is helpful to identify the space and the spatiality, these migration corridors, and the complexity of the migration corridors between sending and origin countries. No, sending and arrival countries, sorry. All right, the second, so it's a very geographic-centered approach. The second origin is the one which was founded by Joseph Nye and Robert Keohane, who was the founder of a transnational approach in international relations, so another field. And so in the 70s, when we are talking about international relations, we were talking about states between each others. So the states in competition or in collaboration, but about states. And the international scene was the scene in which the states had to compete with each other. And Joseph Nye and Robert Keohane highlighted the fact that the states were not the sole player in the field, in the international scene. You had a wide range of other actors, such as the multinational companies, the world parties like Greenpeace, for example, or the church. The church is another player. In the 70s, they did not identify migrants and diasporas as one of the players, but it came after. And one of the things is, very rapidly, is that these transnational actors, they were identified as a kind of competitors with the states, and a kind of something which was adverse to the classical state sovereignty. It was actors who were building networks beyond the state borders, beyond the territoriality of the states. So they were challenging the state authorities, the territorial state authorities. They were developing their own agenda, their own policies, which were against the states. So very rapidly, this approach was a kind of, now in globalization studies, there is a trend who tend to think that the networks of globalization, the global networks, are dissolving the nation states. And the nation state is not relevant anymore in our global world. For example, in France, we got a scholar in the international relations called Bertrand Badi, who really put forward that now he wrote two books called La fin des territoires, La fin de la souveraineté, the end of territory, the end of sovereignty. So the nation state, it's over. And now we are in a world of flows, of movement, of circulation. So the third strand is the one of diaspora studies. So they really are the ones who try to focus on migration and these socialities beyond borders. I'm not going to develop, but it's very rapidly they try to connected with this issue of transnationalism against the state. And for example, Schaeffer wrote a book, Is Diasporas a Threat to Their Host? Their host meaning the state. So there was a belief that these transnational connections were a challenge to the state's policies. They were adverse to integration. So because people were maintaining links with their origin country, it was contrary to the assimilation trends that the migrants are supposed to embark in. So you get this context in the 80s, early 90s, and in this context, and the context is super important. 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the USSR, and you got a world without which is losing its structure. The East-West opposition, which has framed the intellectual and mind of these times, is collapsing. So now people are really shifting and looking for another structure in the world. And they found in this network of flows and circulation and mobility a way of understanding a new world, a world beyond the nation state. And so in this context, you get this book called Nations Unbound, wrote by someone who is called Nina Glick-Schiller, and the co-author are Christina Santon-Blond and I forgot the third one, which is regarded as the founding book of transnational studies. So I can't write it, but you will find easily. Maybe you know already. I'm sure you already know this book. And this Nina Glick-Schiller, Linda Bask, yeah, that's the third one, Linda Bask. And so Nina Glick-Schiller and the co-authors, they defined transnationalism as a process through which the migrants, what's the definition? Sorry. I should know that. Yeah, I don't need the computer. The process through which migrants maintain long-distance linkages with their society of origin and build up what they call transnational social fields. This issue of this idea of social field is borrowed from Bourdieu, the Bourdieusian idea of social field and field. So they create a world in their own. They create transnational communities, and in which you get a set of interaction and interrelations between migrants. So this issue, this idea of transnationalism, brought forward by Linda Bask, has been picked up by other very prominent authors like Alejandro Portes in the US, or Steven Vertovec. He was in the UK at that time, and other authors, and there is now a focus which was really on transnational communities, like Hometown Association. It's a small transnational community. And then there is a kind of enlargement of this focus, and now we focus on issues like long-distance voting, for example, so the people who vote from abroad, or the creation of transnational religious communities, or political parties, or also transnational entrepreneurship, or transnational families, the connection of families. So you get a widening of issues, of methods, people coming from different disciplines, coming in, forging new concepts, new conceptual tools. And then you also have now conferences, journals about transnationalism. So early 90s, you had Diaspora, a journal of transnational affairs, which was created as well. So now it's not anymore just an issue or a topic. It's a paradigm. It's really a paradigm. It's something which is really coalesce the research effort of a lot of maybe several hundreds of researchers around the world. So it's a very, very successful paradigm, including me. But this paradigm now is still debated. It's still put in question. And I've put here a series of questions because you get also a lot of critiques toward this paradigm. the first one is the real the definition of transnationalism and transnational practices. We got a problem here. Because you get people who use a very loose, wide conception of transnational practice or transnationalism. For example, you get someone who work on symbolic transnationalism. So it's about the sense of belonging. Just the mere fact of having a sense of belonging with the country of origin defines already a form of transnationalism. And you get other authors who say, oh no, in order to be transnational, people have to be active and show and display an active engagement into transnational practices. So they must do something concrete, either circulate or pick up a phone or engage in a long-distance voting or participate in a development project, something which is concrete and real. And this is a big problem because when you measure transnationalism, if you use a loose definition of transnationalism, you will end up with a result by saying, okay, 99% of the migrants are part of a transnational space or transnational social field or whatever. Even if they don't move, it's okay, they can be part of a transnational social field. If you use a narrow definition of transnationalism, then you will find that, okay, you will end up with by saying that transnational activities are rare. It's a seldom observed practice. In reality, only a few percent, a handful of the migrants engage actively, participate in this transnational space. So, is it a rare phenomenon or a widespread one? It depends on the definition that you use. Is it a novelty? The second problem is it new? So some people would say, okay, it's a product of our times. It's a product of the new communication means, of internet, of cheap transportation. And thanks to these new technologies, people can easily connect with their homeland and develop sophisticated activities. Others would say, oh no, it's not new at all. You had for example, the Irish from the US in the 19th century were actively participating in the funding of the Irish Republican Army. You had transnational network of anarchists around the world, spanning the Atlantic in the Europe, connecting to the US. So, is it new or not? So, this is another question. So, well, the third question is it an obstacle to integration? As I mentioned earlier, I said that, initially, transnationalism was perceived as adverse to state sovereignty on the one hand and to migrant integration on the other. But now we have tried to focus more closely on the actual process. And now, thanks to the research we have done, we tend to say that there is a transnational hump. It is to say that in the early stage of the migration process, the early years of settlements, transnational involvement tends to increase with integration. When people settle, when they get their papers, they get a job, they get an accommodation, they are more stable and they can involve and spend more resources into development activities. But then, with time, you get a decrease in the transnational connections because people tend to lose their family connections. For example, their parents die, or they lose the connections with their friends, so they don't have any reason anymore to connect with these people, and we tend to say that there is kind of assimilation process. Well, we can talk about. I don't like this term assimilation, but maybe So it is like that: integration and transnationalism. Transnationalism, is it against the state? And once again, okay, as I said, okay, it's against state sovereignty. Yeah, but when you look more closely, you can find that you get a lot of states which support, actively support, and even create transnational activities and fields. And it was my case with the development activities. There are loads of efforts by Morocco, by Mexico, by El Salvador, by India, by many countries in the world actively support development activities. You get also a lot of countries like Algeria who support the political transnationalism of their expatriates abroad. They give them the right to vote, for example. So things, when you look more closely in detail, it looks much more intricate, intertwined, and you get some efforts, some transnational activities which are supported, other which are combated, or which are states tend to try to control and to constrain them. So it's once again, it's much more. The picture is much more complicated. And the last issue, which is on the agenda at the moment, I'm not going to talk long because it's much more theoretical. It's transnationalism and epistemology. People tend to think that so far the social sciences have been directed by what we call methodological nationalism. It is to say we tend to think social phenomena within the confine, within the limits of the state. And so the social is created, is a product, an outcome of the state. And now we tend to think that this approach, what we call methodological nationalism, has obscured, has glossed over all these dynamics which cross the borders, which are very important, extremely important. And actually the limits of the societies are not the limits of the states, of the state boundaries. So we try to find another way of thinking the social, thinking the states. We try to find other ways to measure new methodological tools, a new vocabulary, a new way of thinking the human being beyond methodological nationalism. All right, these are a few of the issues I've tried to address in my work as well. And I will talk about that, everything directly or indirectly when I will present my work. But I try to focus on one particular issue, is this question of transnationalism against the state, with or against the state. All right? Okay. So first, an outlook of the transnational practices in the Mediterranean. So here I have used a survey which has been carried out in France, which is called Trajectoire et Origine by a demographic institute called INED. And here I just use the data regarding Moroccans and Algerians. And you can see that, and here, there is a lot of questions about transnational practices, and I have created, I try to distinguish between private and public practices. So private, it means within the family sphere, with friends, with parents, with brothers and sisters, and so on. So the sending of money, the contacts, the telephone contacts, this kind of stuff. And then the public transnationalism, which is, and I here distinguish two subcategories, the associative transnationalism, so participation in collective remittances, for example, or participation in association projects. And political, so association transnationalism on the one hand, and political transnationalism on the other. So interest in the political life, the vote from abroad or vote at home, participation in political parties, etc. So you can see here that the Moroccans and Algerians are two groups with very different patterns of transnational engagement. The Moroccans are much more active in the family and associative sphere, but the Algerians are much more active in the political sphere. All right, so here you can find I'll tell you why. But before telling you why, I also want to show you how it evolves over time. And here you can find this transnational hump, but in a more detail, in a way. So you can see that there is a general tendency over time to limit and to a diminishing of private transnationalism. As I said, the private ties tend to diminish over time because of the death or because of the loss of contacts with home. What remains and what are proportionally more important are the public transnationalism. So the political and the associational practices. And it's absolutely, you can see it, and also, there is less and less practices at all over time as well. This is the blue part, the bottom of the bars. All right, so bottom, no transnationalism. The red one is private, and then the top you got public and the different forms of public transnationalism. All right, so this is particularly obvious in the Algerian case. It's absolutely, here you can see that this trend is, but you can also read it in the Moroccan graph. So why is that? What can we say from these two set of graphs? So the first thing you can say is that the social dynamics matter a lot. There is a human dimension to transnationalism. That's a paper from Jürgen Carling, which is, I think, very important. The evolution of the social networks really impact a lot on the nature of transnational activities. And the second, the Moroccans Algerians are different in that regard, because the Moroccan groups, Moroccan migration, probably you know it, in France are much more recently arrived than the Algerians. The Algerian migration started in the late 19th century, and the Moroccans, they arrived mostly after the Second World War and mostly after the late 60s. So the Moroccans are, in average, younger. So they have more friends, they have more parents abroad than the Algerians. And the Algerians, the second and third generation, is more important as well than for the Moroccans. So the social dynamics and the social structures matter a lot. The second thing which matters are the political structures. Because you can see that here there are two different behaviors regarding the political sphere. And the reason is very simple. So the Algeria has granted to Algerians abroad the right to vote in 1966. So they vote for a very long time. And Algeria has always regarded its nationals abroad as a political resource, as a way they try to get the votes from the expatriates in order to legitimize the government, to legitimize the power in place. The Moroccan government has another attitude. There is no right to vote for the Moroccans abroad so far. Well, on the paper, yes, they have, but it's very recent and has never been implemented. And so the Algerian government tend to see the Moroccans abroad as much more subversive, as much more an opposition group, and there is a historical distrust between the Moroccans abroad and the Moroccan governments. But what they see, they tend to see the Moroccans abroad as a financial and monetary resource. The transfers, the remittances, constitute a large proportion of the a large resource of foreign currency. It's very economically extremely important for the Moroccans. So they encourage remittances, and so they encourage private transnationalism. And the Algerians, when it comes to finance, they tend to discourage remittances because they have gas. They have gas, so it means that they have enough foreign currency. And so they have adopted historically a protectionist attitude toward the international trade and international remittances. So the amount that Algerian migrants are allowed to transfer to their home country is limited. There is a cap. So the remittances constitute a very small proportion of the compared to as an economic resource. All right. So here you got two sets of policies which are completely opposite, and they impact heavily on the attitude of people between the origin and arrival countries. All right. So here you get one beginning of answer of this relation between the states and transnational practices. Things are much more complicated than they appear at the first sight. All right. So now, how long do I have? I don't remember when I started.
Yeah, maybe 15 minutes.
15 more minutes? Okay. All right. So collective remittances. So here, just a few examples of collective remittances. So it's a water tower in the middle of the Atlas Mountain of Morocco. This is a social center where you get alphabetization courses and for women or courses. And this is a mosque. So I put a mosque because it's probably the first kind of collective remittances that people start with. It's a religious building. So usually people start with things which are religious because it's much more legitimate in the eyes of the villagers. And also they try to get some credibility and try to learn how to do these collective remittances. And then they move to much more complicated or development activities like electrification, water towers, which are a bit less legitimated in the eyes. Symbolically speaking, it's a different bearing and a different impact on the village. But it works as well. And then at the bottom left, there is a big hospital, and this is an Indian project. And I said that the Indians are much more successful, economically speaking, than the Moroccans and the Algerians. They can, when they put money together, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds. So they have a huge financial capacity. And also, they have also the specificity of the Indian diaspora. It's a worldwide diaspora. So when you get a hometown association, they have a branch in the UK, another one in Canada, another one in the East Coast of America, another one on the West Coast, and possibly another one in Hong Kong. And so these networks are worldwide networks, and they have a much broader financial capacity than the North Africans. So they are able to build up hospitals, which cost a lot of money, which are not profitable at all. But it's like that. And now we get in Punjab too much hospitals, because each village wants its hospital. It's awful. There is a plethora of hospitals. So it's becoming a problem. So these are kind of examples of collective remittances. As I said, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Here I try to, based on different data sets in the literature and different registers, I have found these countries which are benefited from collective remittances from France, United Kingdom, and the USA. And you can see that there are a lot. All right, so it's my the map of the fieldwork I did in Morocco. So it's the south of Morocco, or center, depending of whether you take into account Western Sahara or not. This area, it's a Berber area, which is populated by the Schleur. And this is a country which receives the largest amount of collective remittances in Morocco. At least 2/3 of the collective remittances that I could find are directed toward this area. What happened when you go there? So everything that I said from a migrant perspective. But when you go there and you adopt a perspective from the south, from the village itself, what's happening? And so here you try to understand why there was this surge of collective remittances in the 90s. What happened in the world in the late 80s, early 90s? There is in the southern countries. They faced in the 80s a massive economic crisis, and to which these countries responded thanks to the support of IMF and the World Bank, with, or despite, I don't know, depending, with structural adjustment policies. So structural adjustment policies is the implementation of a liberal, some would say neoliberal economic framework for the management of these countries. And part of these structural adjustment policies have been implemented a new governance of local development. So what does it mean? It means that these countries were encouraged to implement a decentralization policy. So more responsibilities to local authorities, more power. So there is a decentralization law in India, in Algeria, in Morocco between 85 and, let's say, 92. There is a big reform in these three countries. And it's the same in Latin America and in other countries like that. And so this is one part of this new governance. So more power to the local authorities, more responsibilities when it comes to the management of development, but not more money. So they have more responsibility, but they have to find money somewhere else. And then the second things that happened at that time in southern countries is the liberalization of the civil society. Now, more and more you can find laws or directives given by governments to free the possibility to create an association, a local association. And most of the time, they tend to encourage development associations. Political associations, much less, but development associations. So not only the local authorities have more power, not more money, but also they are now in competition with other players, which are these civil society actors. And so altogether, so a lot of people first they say to the local authorities, okay, now that you have the capacity to do so, we want our village to be electrified, or we want a health center, we want a school. And the local authorities say, we can't. So what they say is they created their own associations. You got myriads of village associations which were created in these countries in the early 90s. And then what they did is, okay, we got to find money. And very naturally, they asked to the hometown association to provide this money. And this is how the thing started. So when you add to this picture the international NGOs, the big international organizations like the World Bank, the other international organizations. When you also add, you probably heard about co-development policies in Europe. So co-development policies in France, in Spain. These are policies which aimed at co-fund or support the development initiatives of migrants. So suddenly you get a lot of money pouring toward these village development activities and toward these villages. And so you can see that how things started in the 90s and why it started everywhere in the 90s. And so once again, it's not a spontaneous phenomenon. It's related to the reorganization of the state at that time. So it's once again an intertwining between state practices and social practices. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so just a small graph to say how the Moroccan associations evolved in France. It's a graph which was made thanks to the analysis of the register of the Journal Officiel. The Journal Officiel is a register of associations in France. And so you can find when an association is created, they had to be declared at the state authorities in France. And you can find in this register information about the new created association, the goals of the association, the place where it was created, the year it was created, and so on and so forth. And we can see when you look at these associations that there are less and less socio-cultural and civic associations. These are associations who provide services to the migrant community in France. And you get more and more development and hometown association. And it is to say, you get more and more transnational associations who provide services to the community in Morocco. So here you get a term which started in the mid-90s. And you see that since 2002, you get more transnational than local associations which are created in France. All right. So, yeah. I know. Okay. Finish after that. Last slide. Yeah. Well, okay, I talked about Morocco, I talked a little bit about India, but less about Algeria and why it doesn't work in Algeria. So when you compare, you get these three groups, you can find what's important and what is not important. So the associational structures are very important because when you look at these different associations, they need resources. They need people who are capable of finding money, applying for funding at the local government or whatever, co-development schemes or whatever. So you need people who have skills, associational skills. And a lot of the leaders of these hometown associations are former members of unions. And it's true among Indians, among Algerians, among Kabyles. So the existence of this associational elite, and it's true among Mexicans as well, Senegalese in Italy and everywhere. So the existence of the associational elite is one of the basic structures from which this transnationalism emerged. The second thing, I have not talked about that at all, and I won't, but maybe with the questions, are the cultural structures, this conceptual toolbox which enables migrants to make sense of their engagement. So, because most of the time when people talk about these development projects, they use words which are borrowed from their cultural background, from the customary norms and activities coming from the Berber cultural background, or the Punjabis, the Sikh, because the Punjabis, in my case, are all part of this religion called Sikhism. So they talk about Tiwizi, they talk about Twiza, they talk about Seva. It is to say they talk about a kind of customary involvement. We're doing this because it's Tiwizi, and Tiwizi, it's the traditional customary Berber code which regulates the collective participation to public affairs. So you can see that the culture is important. And then you get the political structures, and I said these are absolutely important. They're very important. They are key. And I mentioned these structural adjustment policies and how they reconfigured these transnational activities. And they're important for this dynamic to emerge, and they are important for this dynamic not to happen at all. And it was the case in Algeria. Because in Algeria, as I said, they have gas. So they have money. So they didn't need that much structural adjustment policies. So they did a decentralization. They did a kind of liberalization of civil society. But the actual implementation of these plans were so shallow, so thin, that actually did not give the capacity for the people to act as in the Moroccan case. What I found is that a lot, well, it's just to finish, because in Europe, seen from Europe, we highlighted a lot of this issue of co-development and co-development in France, in Europe, and so on and so forth. This is important, yes, but not that much. It's not crucial. I mean, because it's not because the migrants have the capacity to use a scheme that they will do. And in the Algerian case, they could have access to the co-development schemes, but they did not. The Moroccans did, but not the Algerians, because the social structures, because the political structures in the country of origin did not allow it. Yeah. So that's, I'm going to finish here. Yeah.